10 Stoic Lessons for Retirement. Inner Steel, YouTube script. Cold open. The day he walked out of that building for the last time, he expected to feel free. 41 years. He had given 41 years of his life to that company. Early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays, Christmases rescheduled because the quarter wasn't closed yet. He had earned this. Every gray hair, every ache in his knees, every sacrifice had been building toward this one moment. And yet, standing in the parking lot with a box of his desk items, a framed photo, a coffee mug, a small plant his daughter had given him 3 years ago, he felt nothing he had expected to feel. No wave of liberation. No breath of fresh air. Just a strange, hollow quiet. Like walking out of a theater mid-film and suddenly remembering the world outside has been going on without you. That night, he sat in his kitchen until 2 in the morning and thought, who am I now? It is one of the most disorienting questions a human being can face. And millions of people, successful, accomplished, disciplined people, are walking into retirement completely unprepared to answer it. Not financially. Not logistically. But philosophically. Spiritually. In the deepest sense of self. The Stoics saw this coming 2,000 years ago. They spent their lives studying what happens when a man or woman strips away every external title, every role, every performance, and is left standing face to face with nothing but themselves. And what they found was not despair. It was something far more powerful. This is what we're exploring today. Stay with this until the end, because what's in these 10 lessons may be the most important framework you'll carry into the next chapter of your life. And if this is your first time here, you're watching Inner Steel. If what you find in this video speaks to something in you, subscribe. We do this work every week. Point 1. The Stoics knew your identity was never your job. Marcus Aurelius was, by any external measure, the most powerful man on earth. He commanded the Roman Empire. He had armies, palaces, provinces, and the devotion of millions. And yet the private journals he kept, what we now call meditations, reveal a man who was constantly, almost obsessively, reminding himself that none of it was him. You have power over your mind, he wrote. Not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wasn't just talking about Stoicism in battle. He was talking about the trap that every ambitious person falls into, the trap of fusing your identity with your function. Of becoming so defined by what you do that you forget who you are when you stop doing it. This is the first crisis of retirement, and it is rarely discussed honestly. For decades, when someone asks who you are, the answer is automatic. I'm a teacher. I'm an engineer. I'm a nurse. I'm a manager. The role becomes the self. And when the role ends, when the business is sold, or the career concludes, or the last day arrives, something that felt like identity quietly dissolves. You are left with a blank page where a name used to be. There is a man I want you to think about. His name is not important. What is important is what he did. He spent 38 years as a surgeon. Brilliant, decorated, deeply respected. When he retired at 67, his colleagues threw him a party. There were speeches. There was a plaque. And for about 3 weeks, he felt the warmth of it all. Then the phone stopped ringing. The emails slowed to nothing. Colleagues who had once deferred to his every opinion were now building their own legacies, and he was not in that story anymore. He woke up each morning with nowhere to be, and the silence of his house became deafening. His daughter finally sat him down one evening and asked him something that changed everything. She said, "Dad, who were you before the hospital owned you?" He couldn't answer. Not immediately. He sat with that question for 3 days before something surfaced. A memory of a 17-year-old boy who had loved astronomy. Who had stayed up all night reading about black holes and the expanding universe. Who had wanted, before medical school swallowed him whole, to understand the cosmos. He bought a telescope. He joined an amateur astronomy club. He started writing, not clinical papers, but essays about wonder. About what it feels like to look at a star that took 1,000,000 years for its light to reach your eye. He found himself. Not the surgeon. Himself. Marcus Aurelius understood this. The Stoic practice of stripping away externals is not an academic exercise. It is preparation. It is the philosophical work that allows you to answer your daughter's question before she has to ask it. Retirement will ask you, who are you without the title? The Stoics want you to have already answered it. Point 2. Memento mori is not morbid. It is the greatest motivator you have. There is a Stoic practice that the modern world finds uncomfortable. The Romans called it memento mori, remember you will die. Generals carried small skulls in their pockets. Philosophers meditated on their own deaths not out of grief, but out of clarity. Seneca, writing in his Letters from a Stoic, said, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing." This is not nihilism. This is the opposite of nihilism. Here is what the Stoics understood that the comfortable modern retirement narrative refuses to acknowledge. Time is not unlimited. The years ahead of you are finite. And the greatest tragedy is not that we die, it is that we wait. We wait until Monday. We wait until things calm down. We wait until we retire. And then we retire and wait some more, as though waiting itself has become the habit. Memento mori is the cure. There was a woman named Elizabeth. She had spent her career as an accountant, meticulous and responsible, always deferring her own dreams to the demands of the present. She would write her novel when she had more time. She would travel to Portugal when the kids were grown. She would learn Italian when things settled down. She retired at 63. And for the first 2 years, she still waited. She cleaned the house. She watched television. She made elaborate grocery lists. The novel stayed in her head. Portugal stayed in a magazine she hadn't opened. Then, at 65, she had a health scare. Not fatal. Not even serious in the end. But serious enough to make her lie in a hospital bed for 4 days and hear the question that Seneca had been asking for 2,000 years. What are you postponing? She flew to Lisbon 3 months later. She sat in a cafe with a notebook and wrote the first page of the only book she had ever truly wanted to write. She finished it 2 years later. It was not a bestseller. It didn't need to be. She had refused to die with it still inside her. Memento mori does not make retirement darker. It makes it urgent. It makes it alive. Look at your days as they are. Not infinite. Not guaranteed. Precious in exact proportion to their scarcity. The Stoics didn't meditate on death to be afraid. They did it to be awake. Point 3. Amor fati. Love what has happened, or it will haunt you. Nietzsche borrowed it from the Stoics and named it beautifully, amor fati. The love of fate. Not resignation. Not passive acceptance. Active, fierce, deliberate love of everything that has brought you here. For many people entering retirement, there is a ledger running in the background. A private accounting of roads not taken, opportunities lost, relationships that crumbled under the pressure of ambition. There are men who missed their children's childhoods chasing promotions that no longer matter. There are women who sacrificed friendships and health for institutions that have already moved on without them. If you carry that ledger into retirement unexamined, it will poison the years ahead. The Stoic answer is not to pretend the ledger doesn't exist. It is to change your relationship with it. Epictetus knew something about this. He had been a slave. Not a metaphorical slave, an actual enslaved person, owned, beaten, his leg broken by his master when he was still a young man. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And yet the philosophy he taught, the philosophy that shaped Marcus Aurelius and echoes through centuries, was not one of bitterness. It was one of absolute ownership. It's not what happens to you, he taught, but how you react to it that matters. He could not have meant this cheaply. He had earned the right to say it through genuine suffering. And what he meant was this: every hardship, every injustice, every loss had become the raw material of his wisdom. He loved his fate not because his fate was kind, but because it was his. It had made him exactly the thinker the world needed him to be. There is a man I want you to think about. He spent 22 years building a business from nothing, and then watched it collapse in the 2008 financial crisis. He lost almost everything: savings, a large part of his retirement fund, his sense of self-worth. He spent 3 years in what he later called the dark room. Not depression exactly. More like a sustained fog. When he finally came out the other side, he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "I used to look at that collapse as the thing that ruined my story. Now I know it was the thing that wrote it." He rebuilt. Differently. Smaller, more intentional, more aligned with what he actually valued. When he retired at 69, he didn't retire with regret. He retired with a story he was proud of, and the collapse was one of the most important chapters in it. Amor fati. Love it. All of it. Not because it was easy. Because it was yours. Point 4. The dichotomy of control will save you from yourself. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around a single distinction. Some things are in our control. Some things are not. The wisdom, and the peace, lies in knowing which is which. This is deceptively simple. It is also one of the hardest practices a human being can undertake, because the ego spends a lifetime convincing us we have more control than we do. Retirement surfaces this immediately. You cannot control how your body ages. You cannot control whether the market rises or falls. You cannot control whether your children call more or less than you hoped. You cannot control whether your friends remain healthy, whether illness arrives, whether the world decides your expertise is still relevant. What you can control is breathtaking in its own right. You can control your attitude, your effort, your daily practice, the books you read, the thoughts you choose to entertain, the way you speak to the people you love. You can control what you give your mornings to, what you refuse to let occupy your mind at night. The Stoics spent lifetimes training on this distinction because they knew, the moment you confuse what is yours with what is not, you begin to suffer unnecessarily. There was a retired naval officer, a man who had commanded ships, who had spent 30 years being the person everyone looked to for answers. When he retired, he moved inland to be closer to his grandchildren. And he found, to his bewilderment, that his adult son didn't want his advice. Didn't want him running the household's decisions, or weighing in on the grandchildren's schooling, or organizing family gatherings the way he used to organize operations. He was devastated. He felt useless. He spent 6 months in a low-grade fury, feeling unappreciated and sidelined. Then his wife, quietly, handed him a copy of the Enchiridion, Epictetus's handbook. She didn't say anything. She just put it on his nightstand. He read it in 2 days. What hit him was not gentle. It was clarifying. His son's choices were not in his control. His grandchildren's lives were not military operations. His role had changed, and the question was not how to recapture the old authority. It was how to build a new kind of presence that didn't require anyone's obedience to have value. He started showing up differently. Not as a commander. As a grandfather. He learned to fish, not because it was tactical, but because his grandson loved it. He built a workshop in the garage and taught himself woodworking. He became the quiet, strong presence in the family rather than the loudest voice in the room. His son called him one Christmas and said, "Dad, I don't know what changed, but I love who you've become." The dichotomy of control. It does not diminish you. It focuses you on the terrain that is actually yours to cultivate. Point 5. Voluntary discomfort keeps you sharp when comfort tries to dissolve you. Seneca practiced something that his wealthy friends found baffling. Regularly, deliberately, he would spend several days living as if he had nothing. Eating plain food. Wearing rough clothing. Sleeping without luxury. Not because he was poor, but because he wanted to remind himself that comfort was a guest in his life, not a host. "Set aside a certain number of days," he wrote, "during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" Retirement is the great comfort trap. For the first time in decades, there is nowhere to be. No alarm that has to be answered. No deliverable due by noon. The structure that once felt like a cage reveals itself, slowly, to be the thing that was keeping you upright. And without it, some people simply soften. Not just physically. Cognitively. Emotionally. They stop being challenged and mistake that for peace. It is not peace. It is stagnation wearing peace's clothing. The Stoics practice voluntary discomfort not to suffer, but to stay alive, not biologically, but as thinking, striving, engaged human beings. There is a woman I want you to know about. She retired from a career in civil engineering at 64. She had spent 40 years solving problems under pressure, and she had loved it. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly the absence of pressure would begin to erode her. Within a year, she had stopped reading technical books. Within 2, she had stopped reading much of anything. She watched more television than she ever had in her life. She stopped walking because her knees hurt, and she had nowhere to be anyway. She gained weight. She slept longer and longer each night and woke feeling less and less rested. At 67, her doctor told her cognitive decline markers were accelerating faster than expected for her age. That conversation terrified her into action. She signed up for a mountain hiking group, not because her knees were ready, but because they needed to be challenged. She enrolled in a course on urban planning and future cities. She started getting up at 6 every morning, not because she had to, but because she had decided that she did. She told me later. "Comfort was the enemy I never thought to fear." Voluntary discomfort in retirement is not punishment. It is maintenance. It is the cold water that keeps the engine running. Pick up something hard. Learn something uncomfortable. Push the body when it wants to rest. Not to achieve anything for anyone else, but because the alternative is not peace. It is slow dissolution. Point 6. Community is not optional. The Stoics built their philosophy in public. There is a popular image of the Stoic as a solitary figure. A philosopher alone with his thoughts, indifferent to the noise of others. This is a profound misreading. Marcus Aurelius led armies and administered an empire. Seneca was a statesman and playwright immersed in Roman public life. Epictetus ran a school and taught hundreds of students. The Stoics were not hermits. They were deeply embedded in community, not for social comfort, but because they understood that human beings are, by nature, social creatures, and that to be cut off from meaningful connection is to be cut off from something essential to the soul. Retirement research, and here the science agrees with the ancients, consistently shows that social isolation is one of the greatest predictors of cognitive decline, depression, and early mortality in older adults. This is not abstract. It is one of the most concrete risks you face when the structure of a workplace removes you from your daily community of colleagues. Think about what the office actually provided beyond work. Purpose, yes. But also, faces you recognized. Conversations. Conflict, even, which is also a form of connection. The background hum of human presence that most of us took completely for granted. When that disappears overnight, the silence it leaves is not retirement. It is a kind of exile. There was a retired teacher, a man named George, who had spent 34 years educating teenagers, most of them in a tough urban school. He had been an institution in his community. Known, respected, needed. When he retired, he thought he would enjoy the quiet. 6 months in, he wasn't sleeping. He was irritable in a way he couldn't explain. His wife said he seemed to be disappearing right in front of her. A woman named Rosa retired at 62 and within 18 months had lost both her mother and her best friend of 40 years. The two deaths came 6 months apart. She did what many people do in the face of such loss, she kept moving. She stayed busy. She didn't allow herself to sit with it. 3 years later, she was still numb. Still functional. Still performing the motions of a retired life. But nothing felt real. Nothing reached her. She described it as living behind glass. She could see the world, but couldn't touch it. Her therapist, who happened to be familiar with Stoic philosophy, gave her a strange assignment. She told Rosa to spend 1 hour each week deliberately remembering her mother and her friend, not to manage the memories, but to feel them fully. To let the grief move through her the way it needed to. Rosa resisted. It felt indulgent. It felt like something that would break her. But she did it. And what happened surprised her. The grief was enormous. And then, slowly, it began to move. It didn't disappear. But it stopped being a wall and became something she could see through. The memories of her mother stopped being painful and started being warm. She could finally laugh at stories she had been too numb to touch. Seneca's 1 day of grief is not a rigid prescription. It is a philosophical principle: give sorrow its due, and then return to life, not because the loss wasn't real, but because the life ahead of you is also real. Let yourself grieve. And then let yourself live. Point 8. Wisdom is the one thing retirement cannot take from you. Of all the Stoic virtues, courage, justice, temperance, wisdom, the ancient teachers were clearest on one thing: wisdom is the only possession that cannot be taken from you. Money can be lost. Health can fail. Status evaporates. Relationships end. But what you have genuinely understood about the nature of life, about yourself, about how to be a human being, that belongs to you permanently. This matters enormously in the context of retirement, because retirement arrives precisely at the moment in life when most people have accumulated their greatest wisdom, and our culture, which worships novelty and youth, often makes them feel as though what they've learned is no longer valuable. This is one of the great lies of modern life. Cato the Elder was a Roman statesman and soldier who, in his old age, with no particular reason to do so, taught himself Greek. He was past 80. When asked why he was learning something new at such an age, he replied, "It is the best age I have left." That is wisdom made active. That is a man who understands that the harvest of a lifetime's thinking is not a retirement gift to be wrapped and put on a shelf. It is a living resource, for himself, for his community, for the people who come after him. There is a man I want you to know. He spent 30 years as a corporate lawyer, the kind of career that consumed everything around it. He retired at 68 without any particular plan, and spent the first year feeling as though his expertise was stranded, relevant to nothing, needed by no one. Then a neighbor's son came to him in a panic. He was 24, had just started a small business, and had received a legal letter he didn't understand. The retired lawyer looked at it in about 4 minutes and told him exactly what it meant, exactly why it wasn't the catastrophe it seemed, and exactly what to do. The young man stared at him. He said, "How do you do that? How do you just know?" The lawyer laughed. Then he thought about it seriously. And he realized that what he carried inside him, 40 years of judgment, pattern recognition, practical wisdom, was not obsolete. It was concentrated. It had been refined by time into something that no young person, no matter how educated, could buy or hurry. He started mentoring. He started writing. He joined a nonprofit board where his legal mind helped them navigate decisions they had no one else to make. He began teaching at a local law school 1 afternoon a week, not the law itself, but the art of judgment. How to think clearly under pressure. How to see what others miss. Your wisdom is not a relic. It is not a trophy from a career now over. It is the most refined resource you have ever possessed. Find the places that need it. Offer it freely. Watch what grows. Point 9. The present moment is the only life you actually have. Marcus Aurelius returned to this point again and again in his journals, as though he couldn't trust himself to remember it without constant reinforcement. "Confine yourself to the present," he wrote. "Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present." This is not platitude. For a man who commanded an empire and understood that tomorrow could bring plague, invasion, or assassination, this was a hard-won daily discipline. For people in retirement, the present moment has a particular enemy: nostalgia and anxiety fighting over territory that belongs to either of them. Nostalgia says the past was better. It replays the golden years of career achievement, the energy of youth, the years when the children were small and the house was full of noise. It makes the present feel diminished by comparison. Anxiety says the future is threatening. It catalogs the things that could go wrong: health, finances, loss, dependence, irrelevance. It turns what should be the freest chapter of your life into a slow anticipatory dread. Marcus Aurelius would have recognized both of these as what they are: exits from the only life available to you, which is happening right now, in this breath, in this room, in this moment. There was a retired schoolteacher, a woman named Helen, who had spent decades looking forward to retirement. She had planned it carefully, saved diligently, imagined it in detail. And when it finally arrived, she discovered she could not stop looking backward or forward long enough to inhabit it. She found herself spending mornings on the phone with former colleagues, reliving old stories from the school. She spent evenings worrying about her health insurance, her savings, the news. She was almost never simply present. Her days were transit between a past she missed and a future she feared. Her granddaughter, 7 years old, blissfully oblivious to philosophy, did more to fix this than any book. One afternoon, the granddaughter was playing in the garden, and she pulled Helen down onto the grass beside her and said, "Grandma, look at this bug. Look how fast it goes." And Helen looked. Really looked. At a small beetle moving through the grass with absolute purpose and direction. And something in her settled. She started keeping what she called a now journal. Not a diary of what happened. A record of what she noticed. The light on the kitchen table at 7 in the morning. The sound her husband made when he laughed at something unexpected. The smell of rain on warm pavement. The feeling of coffee cooling between her hands. The present moment, she said later, was the most generous thing she had ever been given. She had just been too busy living elsewhere to receive it. The Stoics practiced presence not as a spiritual luxury but as a survival strategy. The past cannot be changed. The future cannot be owned. The present, only the present, is where your life is actually occurring. Be here. Completely, deliberately, stubbornly here. Point 10. The final Stoic lesson: a good life ends with philosophy, not regret. Seneca knew his death was coming. Not metaphorically. Literally. Emperor Nero, his former student, had ordered his execution. Seneca was given the choice of how to die. He chose his own terms. The accounts of his final hours describe a man who was, above all, composed. Not because he had suppressed his emotions, but because he had lived in such a way that the final accounting did not terrify him. He had used his time. He had thought deeply, written truthfully, loved genuinely. He had, in the Stoic sense, lived according to his nature. "It is not that I have courage to die," he is reported to have said. "It is that I have had the courage to live." This is the final lesson. And it is the one that every other lesson in this video has been building toward. Retirement is not the end. It is the moment when you finally have the conditions to live most fully according to your own values, your own judgments, your own deepest sense of who you are. Every earlier season of life came with obligations that were, in part, imposed from outside, by necessity, by others' expectations, by the demands of building a life. This season belongs to you in a way no previous season has. The Stoics would not want you to spend it in quiet withdrawal, waiting for the end with polished gratitude and careful non-interference. They would want you to fill it. With learning, with service, with presence, with the kind of depth and intentionality that a life of hard work has prepared you to finally, fully exercise. There is a man whose story I want to leave you with. He is not famous. His name was Thomas. He was a retired postal worker, a man who had spent 35 years delivering mail through heat, cold, rain, and routine. He had not built empires. He had not commanded armies. He was, by the world's metrics, an ordinary man. When he retired, he did something quietly extraordinary. He started writing down everything he had learned. Not about the postal service, about life. About what makes a neighbor feel seen. About what it costs to stay angry at someone for too long. About the look on a child's face when they receive a letter with their name on it. About the small dignities and indignities of daily human life that he had observed from the outside of 1,000 front doors. He self-published it in a small volume. He gave copies to his family, his neighbors, his church. He kept writing. When he died at 81, his daughter spoke at his funeral. She said, "My father always told us he was just an ordinary man. But he paid attention to his life in a way that most extraordinary men never do." That is the Stoic ambition. Not greatness by the world's definition. But a life examined, lived with intention, and concluded without the paralysis of unlived regret. You have time. Perhaps more than you know. Perhaps less than you hope. Use it like someone who understands both of those things. OUTRO. 10 lessons. 2,000 years of philosophy distilled into the questions retirement asks of every one of us. Who are you without the title? What are you still postponing? Can you love the whole of what happened? Do you know what is yours to control? Are you still being challenged? Do you have a community that needs you? Have you grieved what deserves grief? Are you sharing what you've learned? Are you actually here in this life, right now? And when the final accounting comes, will you have lived as if it mattered? The Stoics didn't write their philosophy for scholars. They wrote it for people in the middle of real lives, facing real uncertainty, asking the questions that still don't have easy answers. You are one of those people. And if this found you at the right moment, if something here landed, subscribe to Inner Steel. This is the work we do. Every week. For the people who take their own lives seriously enough to think about them. Go live yours.